Welcome back to another Wednesday night Bible study where we're looking at the life of Abraham, known as Abram, and where we're at right now. Tonight, this is the sixth gathering, sixth installment. We're in Genesis chapter 15, and this is what I'm going to call the covenant, because we're going to talk about the covenant between God and Abram, God and his people. So last time, God appeared to Abram in a vision, where Abram then was able to vent a little bit. He was concerned he had no blood heir, and God did repeat his promise, including that Abram would have a son, his own flesh and blood son, who would be beginning this whole, all of his descendants, more than stars, more than dust, counting the stars and the dust. Okay, then we read the foundational truth in Genesis 15:6. So we'll start there. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. The truth is, righteousness, salvation, is credited or reckoned in return for faith. And kind of relating that to what each of our lives are with Jesus Christ, just as God stamped on Abram's sin ledger, paid in full, that was the reckoned it to him or credited to him as righteousness. Jesus Christ's sacrifice did the same for us. So God now continues speaking to Abram. He just right after that, Abram believed in the Lord, and he credited to him as righteousness. Very next verse. He also said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to take possession of it. But Abram said, O sovereign Lord, how can I know that I will gain possession of it? So the Lord said to him, bring me a heifer, a goat, and a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon. So God here is affirming his promise of land. But Abram asks, how can I know you'll do as you said? I think this is very telling for some of us who get bogged down in thinking, okay, it's being unfaithful to even talk with God or question God about how his plans are going to work out. Here is an example of someone who's definitely a man of faith, who does ask the questions. God, how can I know you'll do as you said? You might expect a rebuke from God for Abram's lack of faith, and that's what I'm saying. It's not really a lack of faith. God knows Abram's heart, and instead gives him a revelation. And then he tells Abram to gather some animals. Now, doesn't this look like a setup for a blood sacrifice? But we'll see it's something very different. In Genesis verse 10, chapter 15, Abram brought all these to him, cut them in two, and arranged the halves opposite each other. The birds, however, he did not cut in half. Then birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abram drove them away. So there wasn't going to be any burning going on, not that kind of sacrifice. Splitting of these animals and arranging them was symbolic of a covenant. A covenant. That's a word we don't use too often. We don't really get into covenants, but really we do. They're just by other names. Let me just talk about that a minute. So here we have covenant, coming from the Hebrew word brit. It has a wide variety of applications in back then and as well as today. Between two businessmen, a covenant is what? A contract. In a country, a covenant is a constitution. Between two nations, a covenant is a treaty. I found one of the best single definitions of a covenant I found is this: a legally binding formal expression of intent. A legally binding formal expression of intent. In Abram's time, there were several types of covenants, including one that we don't hear about much, a covenant formalized by eating together. This was a covenant of bread or a covenant of salt. The most binding of all covenants was the covenant of blood, formalized by passing through the divided halves of sacrificial animals. This was the covenant God made with Abram. Passing through the divided halves of sacrificial animals. This covenant means God will never break his promise. God will never go back on his word. So directed by God, Abram was preparing for this covenant. And then we come to verse 11 that we just read earlier. The birds of prey came down on the carcasses. It's interesting why that appeared. It's not really explained, but this may be a symbolism for a pretty bad prediction God is about to make. So the animals are prepared. Now we're at verse 12. As the sun was setting, Abram fell into a deep sleep, and a thick and dreadful darkness came over him. Then the Lord said to him, "Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated 400 years." So, picture that. Abram is in a deep sleep, and it gets dark. Not just nighttime, but a thick and dreadful darkness. God has an unpleasant prediction for the future of Abram's descendants. What God is doing is revealing a slice of the future. Abram's children, the Hebrews, would be aliens and slaves for 400 years. Anyone want to venture what God is talking about? Hopefully you've thought about the Egyptians that get carried off to Egypt. The Hebrew people getting carried off to Egypt, becoming slaves for 400 years. So God's sovereign and predetermined plan was revealed here by God, just in this verse here. Abram was told that a 400-year period of enslavement and oppression would come upon his family. And the 400 years, just to be precise, it's a round figure that is given more exactly as 430 years in Exodus, in the book of Exodus, much later. This is Moses' writing, where they do leave Egypt. It was 430 years of enslavement first happened. But now God's revelation isn't all bad news. God also revealed that there would be redemption. Verse 14, "But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterwards they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your fathers in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure." So after 4 generations, if you figure 100 years each, remember people lived a lot longer back then, Abraham's descendants would return to the land. We know, but Abram doesn't, that Moses would lead them out of Egypt. The oppression nation would be Egypt, and it would be judged. The Hebrews would come out with many possessions, and the Hebrews would come back to the land of Canaan, the promised land. And God gives Abram a bit of personal good news there. Did you catch that? Abram would live to a good old age. After these predictions, the covenant between God and Abram is finalized in verse 17. "When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch appeared and passed through the pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram and said, 'To your descendants I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates.'" He even defines Israel. "The land of the Kenites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaites, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites." Usually covenants were confirmed by both parties. This implied that each accepted obligations. But notice it's significant, I think, that Abram is in a deep sleep. God alone is passing between the pieces of the animals in the form of a smoking fire pot with a blazing torch. Abram has no part in making this covenant, so nothing Abram does can cause it to be canceled. Here again, I've seen there's just so much from the Old Testament that kind of points toward Jesus. Because it's the same for you and me in our salvation. You and I contributed nothing to our salvation. Jesus did it all. All we must do, all we can do, is put our trust in God. God will keep his covenant promise to save us for Jesus' sake. So there you have it. God even specified the geographical boundaries of Israel's land there. From the river of Egypt, that's not the Nile, and Wadi al-Arish River, not the Nile River, to the great river, the Euphrates. Israel has never possessed this land in its entirety, but it's believed she will when Christ returns. So here we got first a promise from God, now it's a covenant. Abram's descendants would be a blessed nation. I'm sure Abram and Sarai are overjoyed. Still, how could this be possible? They're getting old and they don't have any children. All they can do is wait. And this is where impatience can be a problem. And we'll talk about what happened next time. In the meantime, y'all take care of yourselves and may the Lord be with you.